All right, so hello, welcome to PPAN's October webinar titled Carpe Noctem, the wonderful world of bats. Thank you all so much for being here today. We've got Dr. Rick Adams from the University of Northern Colorado, and we're really excited. Thanks for being here, Rick. My name is Anna Gray Anderson, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN. For those of you who aren't familiar with our webinar series, we usually host a monthly event, so be sure to sign up for our e-news and check out our events calendar to keep up to date with all of our upcoming events. For instance, we have another webinar next week about neonics on the 16th. We've got several upcoming native seed swaps, and then the Pollinator Summit is on November 18th. So for today, we've got a great presentation prepared for you, but first we just wanted to tell you a little bit about us. So we're People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN, the host of this webinar. We focus a lot on making Colorado a safe haven for all who live here, from people to pollinators. We do this through grassroots advocacy, education, and outreach, kind of like this webinar. We also do a lot of policy, community mobilization, and habitat creation work. A good example of that would be our Habitat Fund, which is based off the sales of the pollinator license plate. And those sales go towards creating pollinator safe spaces while promoting community mobilization. So again, we're so grateful to have Dr. Rick Adams from the University of Northern Colorado with us. Dr. Adams is Professor Emeritus at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley. He studied bats since 1984 in Colorado, Wyoming, the Caribbean islands, Belize, South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, and as well as in the giant panda habitat of Sichuan province, China. His research encompasses ecology, evolution, and conservation. Dr. Adams is also the president and founder of the Colorado Bat Society that works to conserve bats and their habitats within the state. So throughout this webinar, we're super excited to learn about the importance of bats as pollinators and their importance to ecosystems. They're really incredible champions of biodiversity, and we'll also learn a little bit about how human actions impact them. And before we get started, and just as a reminder, please stay muted, leave your questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation, time permitting. And we are recording this presentation, so we'll post it to our YouTube channel shortly after. We also encourage you to make a donation today so that PPAN can continue to host this free webinar series. And these donations will also support our education, advocacy, and habitat creation efforts. A donation of any size really does make a difference, so thank you for your consideration. And we can put a link in the chat to make it easy for people. And that being said, I will pass it over to Dr. Adams.
Well, thanks everyone for showing up today and learning a little bit about bats. Okay, well, thanks for the overview, Anna Gray. And so I'm probably going to go kind of fast today because there's a lot to cover. And, you know, I've cut this down to 3 hours. So I think we'll be good. But seriously, there's so much to talk about bats these days. It's kind of hard to pick and choose what we'll cover, but I've picked out some things, some of which go in a little more depth about bats and plants and pollination and that sort of thing, specific to this group's interests. Okay, well, just some quick back facts. There's about 1,480 species worldwide today. And in terms of the diversity there's about 5,200 species of living mammals. And so bats make up about 25% of all living mammal species today. You know, the most speciose group is rodents, and they make up about 45% of all living mammal species today. And so I like to tell people if you're a mammal on Earth today, there's about a 70% chance that you're a bat or a rat. Bats have very high heart rate. Bats evolved from shrews, and they probably inherited this from shrews. But 1,200 heartbeats a minute in flight, that's 20 beats a second, almost hard to imagine, but that's the way they do it. Because of this, they eat a tremendous amount of food, which has to do a lot with controlling insect populations and dispersal of fruits and seeds we'll get into. But so a bat that weighs, say, a little brown bat that weighs 6 grams will eat 6 grams of insects a night. And if you think about the weight of most insects, particularly down to the size of mosquitoes, that can each individual is eating thousands of insects a night. And so because of this high metabolic rate, they need to do this. They do it in several bouts, not all at once. So it's amazing they can eat that much, but they do. They use sonar to get around, although bats have good vision. Vision doesn't work in complete darkness, so this allows bats to navigate and to find insects in complete darkness. They don't need any light at all. They can just use sound. The sonar used by bats is very loud. It's above our hearing range. We can't hear it for the most part. But measurements taken 4 inches away from a little brown bat, which again weighs 5 or 6 grams, less than a dime, is about 120 decibels. And that's pretty loud. A smoke detector, if you put your 4 inches away from a smoke detector, that's 105 decibels. So it's louder than your average smoke detector. So I guess it's kind of lucky we can't hear them because it'd be kind of hard to sleep at night. Again, eyesight is good to excellent with some color capacity in most species. And bats are very long-lived, 40 years or more for species that have been measured in the wild. And so they're not like rodents in the sense of only living a couple years and producing a lot of young over short periods of time. They have longer lifespans and generally only produce one young a year. In Colorado, most of the bat diversity is on the western slope and into the desert southwest. You can see on this map that eastern plains tend to have the least number of species, usually 2 to 4, somewhere in there. As you get into the Front Range, Boulder County, etc., you get 10 to, if you go down south here, 12 species. Once you get over on the western slope, all 19 species are there. And this involves 2 different families, the Vesper bats in Vesper tilionidae, which is most of the species here, and then the Melocidae, which are the free-tailed bats, like Mexican free-tailed bats, which we'll talk about a little more, are also present in the state. They're all primarily insectivorous, although some bats do potentially go for nectar and pollination as well. We'll get into that. And again, the highest species diversity is out west. Where do bats come from? They've been around for quite a while, at least 52 million years. And that's where we find full-bodied bat fossils. And these have been gathered out of the Green River Formation in Wyoming. These are the oldest bat fossils known on Earth. And so it's possible bats evolved in the US, in North America. And but it's not really known because the fossil record doesn't go any deeper. And these bats show up as full bats. They're not half bats or anything like that. There's 3 different species that have been identified, and they, again, at 52 million years old, they're the oldest full-bodied bat. But some older teeth have been found in Asia that date to 66 million years. And, but, you know, it's hard to tell the difference between shrew teeth and bat teeth. There's subtle differences. So, but because these are full-bodied bats at 52 million years, they probably stretch back a few million years that we know. The first ecology is tropical. Believe it or not, Wyoming was tropical rainforest 52 million years ago, and bats evolved in the tropics. And of those 1,480 species around today, about 80% of them are tropical and insectivorous. Even these fossil bats have inner ear adaptations for echolocation, and so we know they could already echolocate. Uh, my lab has been working on development of echolocation in bats, and we've come to the conclusion that this is also something that they inherited from shrews and did not evolve in bats, because species of shrews today have been found to use a very primitive form of sonar. And so bats may have inherited both their metabolic rate and their ability to use sonar, and then modified these to their lifestyles. So anyway, bats been flying around with insects for 52 million years. So there's been a lot of coevolution between these groups. There are two suborders. There's big bats, Megachiroptera. So bats are in the order Chiroptera, which means hand wing. The wing is composed of the finger bones and a membrane. And so chiro means hand, ptera means wing. Megachiroptera means big bats, and these are old world flying foxes. If you've been in Indonesia, Australia, Africa, you've probably seen these bats. They're kind of hard to miss because some of them get quite large, having up to 6-foot wingspans. They are all frugivorous and nectarivorous. There's not a lot of ecological diversity there or morphological diversity except in size. And so anyway, if you go to the old world in any of these countries, check these guys out. They're amazing. They don't use sonar. They're primate grade vision. They're fly around when there's moonlight and that sort of thing. But echolocation never evolved in this group. And they show up about 25 million years later in the fossil record than the microbats, which are the bats that are here and occur globally. They occur on all continents except Antarctica. And so the microbats are about 1,000 or more of the 1,400 species. And these guys are very diverse and have a very diverse morphologies and ecologies. Globally, they come in all shapes and forms. Some of them get up to 4-foot wingspans and are predatory on rats and birds and other bats. They come in all kinds of colors and even beautiful painted bats from Thailand exist. And so a great diversity in this group. Okay, well, bats are the only true flying mammals, and the only other vertebrate that flies today are birds. And I think we take flight as kind of well, we take it maybe nonchalantly because of birds. We see them all the time, and so it kind of seems normal to be flying around, but it's actually extremely rare. Only 3 groups have evolved flight in the last 600 million years of vertebrates, and that's birds and bats, which are around today, and the pterosaurs, which have gone extinct. So flight in vertebrates is extremely rare. But however, in the groups that have evolved it, they're the most diverse on Earth and really have a global extent because wings allow you to get around pretty easily. Birds and bats fly quite differently, so it's independent evolution of flight ability. Birds, as you can see in this goose, fly very stably. They use their pectoralis muscles, which are their primary flight muscles, to produce the lift that keeps them up, as well as the driving force to move forward. So they're using a single muscle group to both keep themselves up and drive themselves forward, which if you've ever taken a physics class, you know are completely independent motions. One doesn't affect the other. And so it's pretty amazing they can do this with just one group of muscles. But it also makes for a very, very stable type of flight. And looking at this goose, I would say, oh, I'd like to ride on that goose's back. That looks interesting and very safe. However, if you want to ride on a bat, you better be ready for a rodeo because bats are very erratic flyers. And a lot of this has to do with the speed of their motion, that we can't pick up a lot of the individual motion of the wings and the body. But there's another reason. Bats use both the chest and back muscles to fly. And so when a bat flaps down, it keeps itself up. When it flaps backward, it drives itself forward. And so the wings move in a very different way than a bird's wing moves. And a part of this has to do with the fact that birds have feathers, which make up the majority of their wing. And so when a bird flaps down, all the feathers lock together into a flat platform to create lift and forward motion. And when they flap back, it's completely passive, and all the feathers turn to allow air to go through the wing. And so when a bird flaps back, it's not creating any motion in the bird. It's only on the downstroke that is powering all their movement. Bats have a solid wing, and so they can't do that. And because of that, on the backstroke, they turn their wing vertical to the ground. So they take their hands and point them like that and flap back like this. Okay. And so when the back of the top of the backstroke is reached, this tip of the wing flaps back, and that's what drives the bat forward. And so bats are doing it with the chest and the back muscles, and that's why bats don't have big pec muscles like birds do. We can see this is how a bird flaps. And this is high-speed video out of our lab of a young bat learning to fly. And as you can see with the bird, again, a bird is flapping its wings clockwise like this. A bat is going counterclockwise, pointing its thumbs up. And you can see that in this young individual as its wings rotate in this direction as they're flapping. So very different flight dynamics in birds and bats. Not only that, but because bats divvy up the muscles for flight, they can actually flap their wings independently of one another, and birds cannot. They have to flap both wings at the same rate at the same time. In addition, because bats have fingers going through the wing bones, you can see them here, finger bones going through the wing membrane. By curling their fingers, they can make different levels of lift across the wing. This makes for an incredibly dynamic flight profile. So a bat flying 40 miles an hour can make a right angle turn in a distance less than the length of its body, which is quite astonishing. And so when they're flying, it looks very erratic, but actually, as you'll see with slow motion video, it's actually very smooth and elegant. A thing we discovered a few years ago is that bats also can use their tail membrane as a wing. So you see this little brown bat taking off the tailgate of my truck, actually, out in the field with high-speed video. And you can see the tail is flapping up and down. Taking up off the ground is difficult for bats, but they can do it. And the tail flapping is actually out of sync with the wings. And so as the wings hit the top of the backstroke when they're not creating any force, the tail is coming down and keeping them moving forward. Here's a long-eared myotis coming at you. And what you can see here, which is really cool, is that it folds the tail membrane up as it moves the tail from, try this again. It folds the tail membrane up as it moves from front to back so that it doesn't, all right, it's not going to do it. Thought I could move that. But if you watch it, as the tail comes down, it's open. As it goes back, it folds it up so it doesn't create a downward force. So it is using it in the same way as it does a wing. Okay, another aspect of bat, which is really different than most organisms, is echolocation. Now, we do know echolocation occurs in whales and other cetaceans. It also occurs in shrews, as I mentioned. Actually, it occurs in rodents as well. Um, Generally, the sonar of these other groups is very simplistic compared to what happens in the echolocation of bats. Bats, unlike rodents and also cetaceans, which use a series of clicks in order to receive information back from their environment, bat sonar is tonal. It goes from a high to a low frequency. And so whereas a porpoise will go like that, a bat sonar goes from very high to low frequency in microseconds. And this gives a sort of much broader information field that comes back to the ears, and then the bat needs to identify everything that it's hearing. So I kind of describe it as most sonar in mammals is kind of like black and white vision, but sonar in bats is more like color vision. There's that much more information involved in the sonar as it returns to the bat. And so they generate this very loud pulse out of the mouth with the larynx. It's not very different than our own, screaming at the top of their lungs. It's very high frequency, and so it only travels a few meters before returning to the bat's ears, where it can triangulate and determine the location of the insect in space. It can also tell by Doppler shifts, that is, when sound's coming towards you, it sounds a lot louder than when sound is going away. So common example, you're listening to a train go by with its whistle blowing. They'll sound really loud as it's coming towards you and maximize that loudness right at you. And then as it goes by, it immediately starts dropping because the sound waves are being stretched out. Okay, so bats can tell using Doppler shifts like that whether an insect is coming towards them or traveling away from them or something in between. By the time it takes for the sound to come back to them, they can tell distance. And of course, this is bringing in information from all three-dimensional aspects from the environment. So just like you see everything in your visual field, but you can focus on one thing, sound is like that in bats. Well, screaming at the top of your lungs is very tiring. If you have kids, you probably know that. But these bats are doing it for hours a night. So they've evolved a way to kind of cut down on the energy expenditure of doing this. And they do that by setting it up into three different phases. So they have a search phase where they're pulsing their voice about 25 times a second. They have an approach phase where if they see something that's looking like it might be food, they will approach and increase the pulse rate to 50 times a second. And then if they're getting within like a couple meters or so of an insect and they want a really good visualization of what it is they're about to try and capture, they'll pulse their voice 250 times in 1 second in order to get the most detailed information. And this is hopefully what this sounds like. So this is a search phase. Approach phase. And that's the terminal feeding buzz phase. And so again, this saves energy. Flight is also very energy demanding. And so bats, again, need a tremendous amount of food to be able to accomplish all of this. Okay, well, you might think, bats have this incredible flight ability and sonar and plus vision, so they can see pretty well. They have all the advantages, right? Well, as it turns out, over 52 million years, insects have co-evolved with bats, and so some of them have fought back. And so there's an arms race between particularly moths, which bats eat a lot of, and bats. And some of the moths have evolved an organ on their thorax which is called a tympanic organ. And this organ is an ear, and it sets up the moth to be able to actually hear the exact pulses of bats' echolocation. And so these moths can actually hear the bats coming. And so when the bats go into the terminal phase of their echolocation, which is again 250 pulses a second, the moths will go into an evasive maneuver. Some of them have taken it even further and developed a tympanic series of scales that they can scrape these scales together. And this generates ultrasonic sound that mimics the bat sonar call. And so in these species, the Archaeid moths in particular, as the bat gets really close, they'll start scraping these scales together and send out a pulse of ultrasound, which jams the bat's sonar and makes the bat turn away. So it's a pretty neat system. Not only can it be jamming, but for some moth species, it seems to be what we call aposomatic. It tells the bat that they don't taste good. So it's kind of like warning coloration in the sense of the bat will send out this ultrasonic pulse and the bat reacts to it because the bat has learned that if they attack this moth, it's not going to taste very good. So it operates on a couple different levels here. It's pretty neat. So if you're a beautiful moth flying around on a summer night, even though you might even have an ear or even an organ for generated ultrasound, it's been shown that bats still capture those insects about 99% of the time or 98% of the time. But a 2% savings in insects in terms of survivorship actually is huge relative to their reproductive rate. And so it makes a big difference. But anyway, if you're a beautiful moth flying around on a summer night and a bat comes by, chances are this will be the last thing you see. Okay, bats capture insects in their membranes, not in their mouth generally, because catching something in your mouth when you're flying 12 to 40 miles an hour is probably not wise, particularly if it's a beetle with a hard carapace. And so the bats actually catch them predominantly in the tail membrane and then bring it up to the mouth. And a lot of times this ends up being a backward somersault. The bat can come in and catch an insect, bring it up to its mouth. A lot of times they'll clip off the wings because they don't taste very good. Do this backward somersault in less than 0.2 of a second. So it wasn't until high-speed video was shot of bats that we even realized they were doing this. Now, there are some insectivorous bats that are gleaners, and these bats are capable of hovering. And so they don't even use sonar. They have these huge ears, so they can hear really well. And they listen for insects moving around on vegetation and basically then use their sonar very quickly and then dive in and jump on the insect on the vegetation and fly off with them. So that's another way of getting at insects without having to try and run them down when they're flight. Well, it's Halloween, so I thought we'd talk a little bit about vampire bats. There are 3 species of vampire bats in the world. They all live in the New World, so they're South and Central American. There are fossils of vampire bats as far north as New York State on the East Coast. But right now, there are no populations of vampire bats in the U.S. that we know of. Occasionally, there is some individuals that get into southern Texas. But with climate change, they may be coming back. You never know. Anyway, 2 of the species specialize on birds and kind of cruise around and hang around in trees and wait for the birds to go to sleep, and then they'll make a little incision on their toe and drink their blood. The common vampire bat that you see here, this is high-speed video that we took at a facility at Michigan. These are most bats can walk on the ground, but they're not that great at it. They're pretty cumbersome for them. But vampire bats can run. And they run around, they hop around, and they jump over each other and play leapfrog and are extremely agile on the ground. And they use this to get around. So these bats land on the ground and then they try and find prey, usually a larger ungulate that they can sneak up to and make an incision on their hoof or toe or something like that. This is the face of a vampire bat. And these bats, like many of the South American species, actually echolocate through their nose, not their mouth, and which is pretty specialized. If you I don't think this is difficult, try screaming through your nose sometime. It's not easy to do. But anyway, so they do that through their nose. But they also have heat pits on either side of their nose that can tell changes in temperature by a few degrees. They use this to find warm-blooded animals at night, but also they can put their heat pits along the skin and find out where the capillary beds are closest to the surface. And then they can use these highly specialized incisors to make a small incision. They have anticoagulant in their blood, and so they spit on the wound to keep it bleeding. And then they have a tube on the back of their tongue, which fits into this groove and helps pull blood by capillary action up into their mouth. And these common vampire bats, their scientific name is Desmodus rotundus because they fill up so much with blood, their stomach gets hugely distended and they can't even fly and they're waddling around on the ground. But they have the shortest GI tract of any mammal, and so they can process that blood meal in about 30 seconds and pee out the water and then fly off with the good stuff. Human vampires apparently do occur, but I don't know anything about them, so we'll just go ahead and move on. Okay, bats and ecological services. We don't know much about this. Ecological services are defined as services that help us out, that help humans out. And mostly this was developed as a conservation ploy. Maybe that's not the best word, but it's a way to get people to care about nature, which for the most part, most people don't. And so ecologists came up with a way of showing what organisms do for us and why we can't live without them. In terms of studies on ecological services with bats, most have occurred in the US, but other countries are starting to pick up on this. And in terms of the studies that have been done, mostly have involved bats and agrosystems, insectivorous bats in particular. And these are the various kinds of crops that bats have been analyzed. In which they are consuming particular insect pests for these crops. In North America, there's really 6 species that are involved with agrosystems, particularly in the US. Little brown bats, which are endangered now because of white nose syndrome, which we'll talk about in a bit, eat the most number of crop pests. And again, these bats are eating their body weight in insects a night. Big brown bats, and going from left to right, you can see these species here, eat 180, and then it kind of drops off a bit. But among all of these bat species, there's a huge effect on the health of our food and our success at agriculture in general. And a case in point, if we look at one colony, a smaller colony of big brown bats of 150 individuals, these are the numbers of crop pests they will consume in one summer. If we focus just on the cucumber beetles, 600,000 cucumber beetles are eaten, but it's not just that they're eaten because each female cucumber beetle is full of eggs, and they lay about 110 eggs each. And so if a female that's pregnant is consumed at these numbers, then we're talking about eliminating the production of 33 million cucumber beetle larvae. And so the effect is much larger than just individual insects that are consumed. And the overall effect of this is that bats save the U.S. agricultural industry at least $30 billion annually. Now, white nose syndrome has wiped out tens of millions of bats in the East. And people have gone and studied the effects of the loss of these bat populations in the East, and it's been pretty gruesome. A recent study that you may have seen that came out of the University of Chicago calculated the massive increase in pesticide spraying due to the loss of bats in the Northeast, and determined that infant mortality rates grew by 8% in those areas where the bats are gone due to increased insecticide spraying. And this comes down to about 1,300 baby deaths per year. And so this is the first study that actually measured the effect of bats on mortality in human populations. In Spain, I was just at the European bat meetings outside of Barcelona, and this is a really cool study being done in rice fields in Spain, and particularly around the stem borer moth, which destroys rice fields. This woman put in these exclusion tents, essentially, to keep bats out, but allow insects to pass through. And even in some cases, birds could pass through these as well. And what she found was that in the exclusion areas, the number of eggs laid by these moths was exponentially higher. And she calculated that the bat ecological services in these areas equal about 6 million euros per year, just in these particular farms that she studied. She studied 4 different farms. Curiously enough, as I mentioned, it's not just what's eaten, obviously. It's the eggs that are being laid. And she also found in laboratory experiments, she brought these pregnant moths into the lab and played echolocation calls into some of the cages and not in others, and found that in cages where they could hear the bat's echolocation in artificial playbacks, the moths laid 66% fewer eggs than in the groups where there was no bat sonar. And bat sonar also pushes insects around. That insects that can hear the bats will leave an area when they hear the bats flying around. And so we see this in a lot of predatory systems, that predators move prey around so they can't stay in one place. This was the great success of bringing wolves back into Yellowstone and moving the elk around so the elk wouldn't sit in one place and chew all the vegetation to the ground. Also, in terms of natural services, bats and forests, in terms of insect consumption, is really important. Calco excluded bats from South American tropical understory plants and found that leaf damage increased by almost 70% in those areas. Arthropod density about 65%. In other areas, this is done in Indiana, where I monitored hickory seedlings and found that in areas where bats were excluded, the insect density was 3 times greater and had a huge effect on survivorship of seedlings. And in even French Guiana, again, excluding bats from an area causes huge limitations, in this case on seed dispersal of fruits, and which is something we're going to talk about in a little more detail. So Bats are pollinators as well as seed dispersers. In total, and this is just what's known, it's probably a lot higher than this, but at least 550 species and 191 genera and 62 families of plants. Seeds are dispersed by bats in the neotropics. It's been shown that areas that have been clear cut, the first plants that come back are those that seeds are dispersed by bats into those areas, and I'll tell you why that is in a minute. In North America, bats pollinate plants predominantly in two families, the agaves, which if you like tequila, think of bat because they're the primary pollinators of agave, and the ACE, which are the cacti. And so all of the huge organ pipe, cordon, cactus in the southwest, and saguaro cactus in the southwest are bat pollinated. And most of these pollinating bats, of which there are 3 species, are highly endangered and wiped out by humans going into caves and destroying populations. And so bats do a huge amount of plant-animal interactions, which I put in a bunch of stuff here because I know you guys are into this sort of thing. But first, with seed germination, one of my graduate students worked with us in Kruger National Park in South Africa, looking at epauleted fruit bats. So this is a megachiropteran that disperses the seeds of sycamore fig trees. And sycamore fig trees are keystone species in Kruger National Park and throughout South Africa. In fact, if sycamore fig trees disappear, there would be huge ecosystem collapses because just about all animals depend on it in one way or another. She studied the effects of epauleted fruit bat seed ingestion on germination. And so we'd go out at night and she would put plastic under feeding trees, under sycamore fig trees where bats were feeding, and collect the guano and spats that fall onto the plastic sheets. We then go back to the research lab and research camp, and she would plate these out in Petri dishes. And then we also collected seeds from figs that were not ingested by bats, and so she could compare the two. And the bottom line was that 98% of the fig seeds that were ingested by these epauleted fruit bats germinated, whereas less than 2% of the seeds from figs that were not ingested by epauleted fruit bats germinated. So a huge difference in seed germination. And so that's why you see in areas where bats are distributing seeds that you get high growth rates of those plants that are being distributed. In terms of pollinators, there are unspecialized, what we call facultative pollinators. And we have one of those in Colorado, pallid bats. Now, pallid bats are pretty special because they tend to forage on the ground and they eat all kinds of arthropods, including centipedes and millipedes, as well as even scorpions. But they eat beetles and all kinds of ground foraging arthropods. But what we didn't know is that they also visit cacti plants for nectar. We don't know if they're going for the insects that might be in there to get the nectar as well, or whether they're actually drinking the nectar, but they get covered in pollen nonetheless and move from one cactus to another, cross-pollinating those cacti. And so other bats may do this as well. We don't know, but it seems like we're finding out something new about what bats do every year. So in terms of specialized pollinators, these guys are highly adapted for what they do, and there's really nothing like them in the animal world for pollinating flowers, particularly in the cacti flowers. And so these bats are capable of hovering flight. Okay, they have elongated noses and tongues that allow them to get the nectar at the base of the flower while getting covered by pollen on their face. in thorax in some cases. And the amount of pollen they can transfer is huge. And so this lesser long-nosed bat, which is highly endangered, is a primary pollinator of sororocactus, which are also adapted for bats. They open their flowers at night. The flowers are white, so the bats can find them easily. They also put out an odor, which attracts the bats to them. And so the face of the bat is actually very much in line with the shape of the flower. And so this coevolution between these two groups has kind of pushed the bat's faces and flowers together in terms of their shape to make pollination more efficient. This gets kind of extreme. So some of these pollinating bats have really long faces for pollinating really long flowers. Again, these obligate pollinators have co-evolved with bats. They have very good vision, so they can see these white flowers. They have smaller ears that don't get in the way, so when they insert their face in there, they can get down into the flower. And then they have really long tongues with kind of hair-like projections on the tongue to help them get nectar out of the flower. So it's a mutualistic interaction. Bats get food, and then the plants get a transport mechanism for their pollen. Well, just as an aside here, relevant aside here, Darwin wrote a lot of books, and one of them he wrote on orchids and fertilization by insects. And in this book, he talks about this flower in South America that has a 35 centimeter long tube, which is incredibly long. And so Darwin hypothesized that there's got to be an insect out there with a 35 centimeter long tongue for getting at the nectar in this flower. He was really highly ridiculed about this, like he was for a lot of things that ended up being true, because in 1903, the moth was found that pollinates this flower, and this is its tongue. So it flies around with this huge tongue and does pollinate these flowers. Well, a similar story has shown up in bats, actually. Anora fasciculata, the tubelet nectar bat, is a 6 centimeter bat that has a 9 centimeter long tongue. But this bat does not fly around with its tongue hanging out. But here it's sticking it out a little ways. But it pollinates this flower with a huge pollination tube. So it goes in there, and this is with a tube, a glass tube, so we can see its tongue. This is his tongue here, going all the way down this tube into this nectar bowl. So how does this bat do this? How can it have a tongue longer than its body, but not have the tongue hanging out when it's flying? Well, tongues are contractile, and of course, you can stick your tongue out and pull it back in. So some of that is what happens in other nectar bats. But they have a special adaptation. So in other nectar bats, the tongue is originating on the hyoid bone. So this hard bone in your neck here, which is where our tongue originates, which is normal for all mammals. All mammals have tongues that originate there. Well, Anora fasciculata's tongue actually originates all the way down on the sternum. So the hyoid would be here. It originates all the way down here on the sternum, manubrium of the sternum. And so this allows this bat to have an incredibly long tongue and not fly around with its tongue hanging out. So it's pretty cool. It's very similar to Darwin's moths. Okay, well, plants have also done some things to help bats come in and pollinate their flowers. This neotropical vine has an acoustic mirror here. And this acoustic mirror on the flower itself helps direct the bat's echolocation and direct the bat's face right into the flower's tube. And so when bats are echolocating, okay, these are actually AI generated spectrographs of what a bat is seeing with different shaped flowers through using their sonar. So bats can tell the flowers apart, okay, by just using their sonar, not their vision. And again, plants can help direct them in with certain types of adaptations. This particular flower, again, it's another vine. It's not using its flower to direct them in, but has evolved a leaf, okay, which is an acoustic mirror. And so again, the bats come in and echolocate and pick up this acoustic mirror, which directs them to an open flower. And the bats can come in and then get nectar and pollinate those flowers. Another thing, this is really recent, that has come out with cacti. They noticed that some of these cacti, when their flowers come out, also produce this inflorescence called a cephalium, which is all of these little hairs on the side of the cactus where the flowers are coming out. And as it turns out, this is not reflective at all. It actually absorbs the sonar of the bats, okay, and allows the flower to stand out by absorbing the background echolocation. And so where there is no cephalium on this cactus, you know, it's just a big blur of red, all the sonar is coming back to the bat's ears. But where it is, it gets highly muted. Okay, and in the area where the flower is, you get the highest echo return. So this helps the cacti direct the bats into their flowers. Bats also can use leaves as megaphones, and I'm getting short on time here, so I'm going to speed up a little. But they can roost in these curled out leaves and use them as megaphones to call out to other bats to come on in and join them. Other services, echolocation aside, if you've never been to the bridge in Austin where there's 4 million bats that come out of this roost at night, it's an amazing sight. It's a huge tourist attraction. Brings millions of bats in or millions of people and bats into Austin every year. There are also fishing bats and carnivorous bats that eat rodents. And guano, bat droppings, is a huge part of the GNP of many countries globally. Major threats to bats, chiroptophobia is a major one. White nose syndrome, which is a fungus that was brought over from Europe by cavers, got into our cave system and has killed millions of bats, as I mentioned before. But the biggest thing is insectageddon. Rates of insects are dropping at precipitous rates. Moths in the U.S. have dropped by 60%, butterflies by about 70%. But the rate of loss is huge. And this is going to affect insectivorous bats, of course. Biodiversity collapse. We're in a 6th mass extinction. This is the hugest threat to global survivorship, including humans, as mentioned before. We've lost about 52% of birds, mammals, fish, and reptiles and amphibians in the last 50 years, since 1970. Bats are, most populations are in major decline. I was part of a group of scientists that looked at bat populations in North America, and 52% of the bats across North America are in serious trouble. Well, I don't want to end on a bad note. One of the things we discovered is really cool, that bats are active in the winter. So this is actually a video that was shot on a trail cam out at Pawnee grasslands. And this is all snow, and this is in January. And this woman sent me this footage saying she thinks bats are flying around. And as it turns out, we thought bats had to hibernate underground where in cave systems or mine systems where it's highly humid because they don't drink for 4 or 5 months. Um, but as it turns out, they can uh, roost and hibernate in areas if there is a water source that melts on any day where it's above freezing. And so these bats are coming out in January. You can see them skimming the surface of ice. You can actually see the water splashing up because it's melted. And as the bats skim the surface there, they're getting a drink of water. So bats are hibernating in places where we never thought there could by using these melting ponds. And curious enough, we were also already working on this at the same time she sent me this video at Ingersoll Quarry at Ohio Valley Ranch in Boulder County. And we showed that bats are highly active. This is the 25th of January to the 9th of February. And the black bars are bat activity, and the blue line is temperature. And so whenever temperature is higher, we get bat activity at this water hole with the bats coming out to drink water there. Another cool thing we found is bats are in a synergistic relationship with black-tailed prairie dogs. And so bats forage a lot in prairie dog colonies. Even forest bats that don't like to be out in the open will come out and forage in these colonies because prairie dogs are ecosystem engineers and produce ecosystem essentially of high diversity, making habitat for up to 250 other different species that wouldn't be there without the prairie dogs. And a lot of those are insects. And so the bats pick up on this and come and forage in these colonies. So it's pretty neat. Okay, well, bats are cool. And this is kind of a summary. Okay, we're losing a lot of them, unfortunately, due to a lot of factors involving humans for the most part. I will put in a quick plug here that the Rocky Mountain Bat Book has a second edition coming out in the spring, so probably twice as large as the first edition. We've learned a lot about bats over the last 20 years, and so I spent 2 years revising this, and should be out sometime. So I'm sure you'll remember. Okay, we can stop this and we can open it up for any questions if we still have time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rick. Bats are so cool. That was really informative and interesting. And thank you so much for teaching all of us. I don't know if we have any time for questions, but would I be able to email you some of them and send your answers out in a follow-up?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
Yes.
great. And
Sorry
maybe
I
I
went
can
so long.
link the book in the follow-up too.
Okay.
Nice. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. We'll get you those answers to your questions and the bat noise sound in the follow-up. We'll also be posting this video on our YouTube channel. And thank you all for joining. Just a quick reminder to please donate to PPAN so we can continue to host these amazing webinars like this one. And thank you all so much. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much, Rick.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.